Hello, and welcome to using DNA in a client research project to solve a family mystery. My name is Diana Elder. I'm an accredited genealogist, and I will be your presenter for this presentation. You can find more about me at my website, familylocket.com. Reach me at diana@familylocket.com, and I invite you to check out my podcast, the Research Like a Pro Genealogy Podcast. The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of Family Search International and RootsTech. I define the research process in these steps. Nothing new. You may already be doing these, or you may have skipped a few, like me when I was a beginning genealogist. But now that I work professionally, each of my research projects goes through each step, and it has made a huge difference. Even if you never do a client project or work for someone else, going through these steps on your own research will make all the difference. And especially as you add DNA to the mix, you need to make sure that you're focusing on a process so that you can have good results. Today in this presentation, I'll be referring to this slide as we talk about each step and how DNA can be added to that step. First, let's talk about objectives. All research begins with the question, and you probably have many as you look at your family tree. Do you want to confirm a paper trail? Do you want to find the family for an adoptee or an orphan or a foundling ancestor? If so, that you have probably identified a research question that could be answered with DNA. And that is how you will begin your project, forming an objective around that research question. So let's take a look at some possibilities for research questions that could be answered with DNA. And we're going to look at several different kinds of DNA inheritance. So if you have YDNA that you think could be useful, you could use that to determine a paternal line. And this can break down a brick wall, or it can confirm your paper trail of research. I use YDNA in the early years, about 2007, to confirm my paper trail from my Royson ancestor back to the original ancestor, Thomas Royson in Virginia, of about 1650. And so you might have something similar, and that's a wonderful research project. Now, what about the maternal line? Well, mitochondrial DNA can be used, and currently it's being used by the military to identify remains of recovered soldiers. It's always passed down from mother to son without recombination, and something to keep in mind is that a male is the end of the line, but a male can take the test. And so this is good at determining if two people are related through their maternal lines, and it often works best with targeted testing, having determined a line that's possible and then comparing the mitochondrial DNA. Autosomal DNA is all about cousin matching and ethnicity, and we can use autosomal DNA to prove an ancestor within 7 to 8 generations. Because of the large number of people in the databases for autosomal DNA, this is generally what we are working with as we're trying to prove the parents for an adoptee or for an ancestor born within those 7 to 8 generations. And then we don't want to forget about xDNA, and this is a unique inheritance pattern that can help you narrow down matches because it is passed only in a certain way. And so you want to make sure if xDNA could give you some help in your research project, that you are learning about that inheritance pattern and using the testing companies that actually report the xDNA. So this whole thing about objectives, what do objectives really do? Well, they guide our research, and it's important to decide exactly what we'd like to do with our research project. When we're working with DNA, we're looking at a biological relationship. And we may also be using DNA to prove that a certain person is our relative out of many with the same name based on a genetic connection. So when we create an objective, we want to make sure we're including key identifiers, and these include complete names, dates, and places. And that will help us to make sure we don't confuse the ancestor we are researching with someone of a very similar identity. It will also help us when we are comparing records to see if the record matches our person of interest. We won't have to go and look up their name or date or place in a family tree. It'll be right there in our objective. And particularly if we're working on a client project, we're not generally as familiar with the client's family as our own. And so it's good to have all those details right there in your objective. If we're working with DNA, we'll want to say something like, we are seeking to prove a hypothesized identity or a biological relationship. And that wording is important because that can signal to the reader or to ourselves or anyone else interested in the project that we are using DNA. We're looking for the biological relationship. And often we are working off of hypotheses. We have an idea of who could be this ancestor. And so if we put right up front that we are trying to prove a hypothesized identity, then that's good for anyone reading our research to understand our starting point. So we're going to be using a case study for this presentation. And here's the objective. And because this was a client project, I do have full permission from the client to use all the information in this presentation. So here's how I wrote the objective. See if you can understand what I was hired to do for this project. Identify the biological father of Jack Kenneth Green Schaefer. Jack was born 10 July 1926 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and died June 2012 in Norman, Cleveland, Oklahoma. Jack married Marjorie McCormick on 31 March 1945 in Fort Sill, Comanche, Oklahoma. So you may have noticed in that objective there were a lot of Oklahomas, right? And that may seem redundant and repetitive, and maybe you wouldn't want to include that information, but it is really important to have complete places and those complete dates. We're not trying to write a wonderful family history in this objective. We're trying to be straightforward and state exactly what we know and give us some information to start with. Jack Kenneth Schaefer Jr. was the client, and he wanted to find the grandfather, the father of his father, also Jack Kenneth Green Schaefer. Jack Sr. had told the story to his son that once he saw a birth certificate that had a different name than Schaefer, and his mother took it away and would never speak of it again. And later he found a picture of a man with Green written on the back, and he wondered if that was his father. And without any more information than information about the mother, Eldon May Graham, I went to work. After defining the objective and getting that completely nailed down with the client, then the next step is doing some analysis. And this is where you look at everything that has been found, every source, and this is going to include DNA sources. Analyzing your sources is really easily done in a timeline. I like to make sure that I've got everything chronologically so I can see if there's missing census records or missing birth or death information. It also helps you to put a person's life into the context of the history and the things around them. Now, as you're going through the source analysis and analyzing the evidence, we can decide how accurate something is by determining if it's an original, derivative, or an authored source. For instance, if we have a death certificate that's good information for a death, but perhaps not so good for a birth, depending on the informant. So we want to make sure that we are looking at each source and not just taking the information at face value, but we're determining who gave the information. Would they have known about whatever they reported? Or could this have a little bit of an air of someone guessing about information. I once had a project where the birth certificate of a child was off by an entire month. And I only knew that because her mother had died in childbirth and I had the death certificate of the mother. The problem was that the doctor had not filled out the birth certificate for 8 months later, and he misremembered the actual month of the child's birth. So even when it may seem like a very reliable source, as we correlate all the evidence and look at all the sources together, we begin to get a clearer picture of what is happening. Now let's talk about DNA source analysis. DNA results are original sources, and our analysis of those can be wrong if we don't correctly understand how DNA inheritance works. We also work with authored sources in DNA. The family tree of our DNA matches. And as we all know, family trees can be accurate or they can contain a lot of inaccuracies. So just like any other source, we have to evaluate carefully those family trees and look at the sources that have been added to those and use our own analysis to determine if they are giving us good information or not. Each DNA website has tools to help you decide whether a relationship is possible based on the shared DNA. And third-party tools can also help. My favorite is DNA Painter, which has the shared Centimorgan project. So as we're talking about information, our primary information is the amount of DNA that's shared with a person in a match list. Although this can vary very slightly from website to website if you've had your DNA tested on multiple websites and you have the same cousin match on a different website. Generally, it's very close. And using DNA Painter's shared Centimorgan project, we can analyze and see if the relationship that we think is correct really does match up. Is it viable? And we can determine how good our sources are. The family tree, the authored source, is often one of our very best tools to discover our relationships. But as we verify those, we want to make sure that the original and derivative sources that are in those trees are accurate and really will lead us on the right path to discovering our ancestor. After the initial analysis of the sources, we have to decide if we have enough DNA results to actually work with. We can always start with a project and put further testing into future research suggestions, or we can test additional people and work on a paper trail while we're waiting for the results to come back. So a question to ask once we have looked through the DNA is there enough shared DNA to answer the research question, or will there be a need for more DNA testing? Here's an example of a timeline in DNA source analysis. Spelling out the details for both types of sources can help us wrap our minds around the information. So in this example, you'll see that I've got a few sources there that were for Jack, and these sources were all the client had been able to find: 2 censuses and a marriage record. We also have YDNA and autosomal DNA. And we're going to go into much more detail about these sources, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what it could look like if you're putting information into a timeline. And I actually break up my spreadsheet so that one would be the timeline and a completely separate one would have all the DNA information. But here I've just combined them so you can get an idea of what it could look like. Let's take a look at that 1930 census. The client tree had the census attached, and as I was looking at it carefully, I discovered that Elda, green, shown there in the middle in bold, was likely the informant, because everyone else was working outside of the home. Now notice that Elda here is using the surname of Green, and Jack was going by the surname of Green also. If Elda was giving the information, it's likely that she told the census enumerator that Jack was Green and that she was a Green. Notice that she's identified herself as divorced and that she was 17 at her first marriage. Notice also that this is a blended household, meaning that we've got three different families. We've got Ab Graham, who is the head of household. We have his son and daughter-in-law and their child. And then we have another son. And then we have Elda, who's the daughter of Ab and her son. And then we have another grandson. So we've got a blended family here of a lot of different people. And if you think about it, 1930 was the Depression years. And so these people were probably living together and all working so that they could pay the rent and would be able to get by. So the important information to take from the census is that Elda is going by the surname of Green, as is Jack. And remember, that was the name that was on the picture that Jack discovered later. So we also had a marriage record. And this was 1931, just a year later. And Eldon here is going by her full name of Eldon, not Elda, as in the census. And she is now identified as Miss Eldon May Graham. So gone is the surname of Green, and gone is any hint of a previous marriage with the title of Miss. So this is a marriage to R.T. Schaefer, and this was in Oklahoma City. Now, just a few years later in 1940, Eldon and Richard are enumerated again. Now, you wouldn't know this was Eldon because now she's going by Susie Schaefer. She's taken, of course, the surname of her husband, Richard Schaefer, and she decided to go by Susie instead of Eldon. And she is the informant for this census. 1940 is the only census that gives us the informant, marked with a circle and an X. Now, how do we know this is the same couple? Well, for one thing, we have them in Oklahoma City, which was their residence. And then we've got Jack Schaefer. And then we've got a key person. We've got Ab Graham, who is 71 years old, and he matches up with the Ab Graham of the 1930 census. So here we have Eldon, also known as Susie, in Oklahoma City, still having her father live with her, and there's her son, Jack. He no longer is going by Green, now he's going by Schaefer. So it's important to do some analysis of the DNA. And when I looked at the YDNA, there was some really interesting information there. The YDNA test was taken by Jack Jr., and because it's a direct paternal line, it would go back to the biological father of Jack Sr. The Y-DNA match showed a surname of Robb, and the closest match was not that close. It was a genetic distance of 3, which means a common ancestor within 4 to 8 generations, or possibly even further back. Now, providentially, this person who had was a genetic distance of 3 had identified a family line, had a family tree. And he showed that his father was James Robb, who was the son of a James Robb, who was the son of a James Robb, who was the son of a William Robb. Well, doing some initial work on that, I could see that this was not going to help us identify a father, because if the common ancestor was 4 to 8 generations back, it was probably even further than William Robb. And with this common surname, it would be really difficult to pinpoint exactly who a father could be for Jack Kenneth Schaefer. But with autosomal DNA, we can get a lot closer. Now, it's really helpful with the Y-DNA having discovered the possible surname of Robb. It's also possible that the surname was changed and that Jack's father would not have been a Robb, that there could have been another event. But in this case, relationships showed the Robb surname coming through. And we were lucky because there was a good match at Ancestry DNA. And this was for a CS. It was 343 centimorgans across 12 segments, which is significant. And there are not a lot of possible relationships. When you move further back, with only maybe 20 or 30 centimorgans for the DNA match, there are so many different relationships. But with 343 possible relationships were a first cousin once removed or a half first cousin. There were some others also, but these seemed the most likely based on the pedigree. So this match also had a tree that was attached, which was very helpful. And what caught my attention, of course, initially was the surname of Robb. And this attached pedigree showed that there was an Alice Elizabeth Betty Robb, who was the daughter of Richard David Robb, who was the son of Samuel David Robb. And so this gave me an excellent hypothesis to start researching. After having done some good source analysis of both the documents and the DNA, it's time to move on to location. So what do we do with locality research and DNA? Let's take a look. When we're working with DNA, we have to determine a location and a time period where DNA matches and ancestors lived. And particularly in this case, I needed to find a location where conception could have occurred for the resulting child of Jack Kenneth Schaefer Sr. So a really good practice is to create a locality guide for the area that you're going to be researching in the documents. And this will help you guide your research. If you don't know what kind of records or repositories are available, it's really difficult to do some research planning and to dig deeper into a research problem. And then we also have to know enough about DNA methodology that we would have an idea of what tools would be most beneficial to use in the research. Do we want to do some clustering through the Leeds method, genetic affairs, or the company tools? Do we want to do some charting using Lucidchart or other mind mapping tools? Are we going to be trying out some triangulation with pedigrees and segments? Or will we be doing some segment work and painting segments using DNA Painter to find clues? And maybe what are the odds to test theories? So if any of these things are unfamiliar to you, then you'll want to do some good education and try out some of these different tools, because it's really important to know what you should do as you're getting started with a DNA project. So in this case, I did a small locality guide for Oklahoma City. And I say small because I was pinpointing a certain period of time. I didn't need to do a guide for Oklahoma City from its very beginnings to current time. I'm just looking at the 1920s and 1930s, and I had some specific records that I thought would be useful. We already had the census, but maybe going back to the 1920 census, I wanted to see what city directories were available and marriage and divorce records, birth records. So some really specific things for my locality guide. And so as you're working through a research project, you'll want to pinpoint from your source analysis from your timeline the locality and time period most likely to yield some good results for your research. In thinking about what DNA tools that I could use in the case study in this project, I determined that I could simply use the testing company tools and then chart the matches using the shared centimorgan tool in DNA Painter to discover possible relationships, and that I wouldn't need additional testers. My client had his DNA on Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, and 23DNA, as well as the Family Tree YDNA project. So I felt like this gave me good coverage of his DNA on different websites so I could pick up a lot of different matches. And I had some good matches to work with, as I had shown you previously. And so I felt like this was enough to work with to actually make good progress on this case. So now it was time to do some research planning. After setting the objective, analyzing your sources, pinpointing a location, learning about that location, thinking of some good tools, some methodology that you can use for the DNA, it was time to really create a real working research plan. And in research planning, you always want to make a hypothesis. And often people will ask, how do you do a hypothesis? Well, you look at everything you've learned in your evidence analysis step from that timeline. And I like to create a new table and summarize everything in that table, or maybe a bulleted list. And then you can create a hypothesis using clues from what you know and from what you're trying to prove. So I have a hypothesis based on the DNA tree and the YDNA finding that his surname was Robb. My hypothesis was that Richard David Robb was the biological father of Jack and that the child was conceived in Oklahoma City in 1925. So I have a hypothesis, and now I can try to prove or to reject that hypothesis. And as part of the research planning, now I can identify some sources that could prove that hypothesis. I can also choose some specific DNA strategies and tools to use for further analysis of the DNA matches. Although we have an initial feeling, we need to dive deeper into the DNA. And then we need to prioritize the steps for both the documentary research and the DNA analysis. There are so many different things we can do for both documentary research and DNA analysis, but we want to do the things that are most likely to give us the answers that we need. And specifically, if we're doing client work, we want to make sure we're making excellent use of the client's time and money. And so it's important for that prioritization to take place. So here was my research plan for our case study. First, I wanted to see what we had for birth records. And I was very curious about what record that Jack Kenneth Schaefer Sr. found that his mother did not want him to ever see again. And then also, if Eldon was married, as she stated in the 1930 census, and divorced, is there a marriage and a divorce record for her? I also wanted to look at city directories because I found in my locality guide section of the process that there were city directories from 1920 all the way through 1930 and beyond. And I wanted to see if I could get more information on these two people, because the censuses were only 1920 and 1930, and my key point, reference point for the date was 1925. And then I wanted to search even more census records for Eldon and Richard David Robb. Now, what about for the DNA? Well, I wanted to start a chart, and I like to use Lucidchart, but there are other programs that you can use to also map out the matches. And I wanted to show the autosomal DNA matches from each testing website because the client did have his DNA on 3 different websites. I wanted to be able to show all of those. And then I wanted to compare the centimorgan amounts to probable relationships to see if it made sense. And then I also needed to verify the family trees for those autosomal DNA matches. So what's the next step in the research process? Well, I have source citations next, but they really go right along with research logs. And that is because as you are working through your research plan, the very first time that you look at a source, you need to create that source citation so that you'll have it ready to use when you're writing your conclusion, and so that you know exactly what you've looked at with that source. Just creating a source citation helps you to better understand the source and do better analysis as you're researching. So source citations need to be created for both documentary and genetic sources. And the reason why is because this gives our research findings validity. We don't necessarily need to create a DNA source citation at the time we look at the DNA, but we will want to use DNA source citations as we write our report to make sure that we have captured all the information about a DNA match. So here are the elements of source citations. Let's talk just a minute about what this could mean for DNA sources. So the who created the source. This could be the author of a DNA report or the publisher or the testing company, such as Ancestry DNA. The what is typically the database title or a report name, such as Ancestry DNA database report for whoever the test taker is. The when is when was the source created, and this would be the date the database was accessed or the report created. And this is important because the DNA results are being continually updated as new people join the database, and so we want to make sure that we've captured the date that we looked at those results. Where is the source located? Well, this could be the URL of the website, or it could be the address of a person who prepared a report for us, which we would keep private if we were publishing. And then the where within for DNA would be details about the match. Maybe we want to indicate that the match was predicting a 5th to 8th cousin match with a certain user at moderate confidence, and we could give kit numbers, we could give specific chromosomes that we're being matched on. This is where we can give some details about the match. And the reason why we would want to include these in a DNA source citation is because no one else can access that information unless the DNA has been shared with them on the company website or they have the login. And so if we're going to be sharing this in a report for someone who does not have access to the DNA results, we have to give some information about that actual DNA match. So let's take a look at what I discovered and how I created some source citations. So in this example, this is what I found when I did the search for the birth certificate. I actually found 2 birth certificates, well, indexed 2 birth certificates, and notice that the surname of Green is now showing up again. So we have index records for Jack Kenneth Schaefer and Jack Kenneth Green, both born on the same day of 10 July 1926. So what I surmised was that the surname of Green was probably issued at birth and the surname of Schaefer in an amended certificate after adoption by Robert T. Schaefer. So the citation reflects the results, not the original record, which the client will need to order because they're next of kin. So I simply cited what I saw on the website, that this was the Oklahoma State Vital Records Index, a search for Jack Kenneth Green Schaefer, born 10 July 1926, and there's the website, OK2 Explorer with the URL and the date of access. Now, here's an example of a negative search. And we want to include citations for negative searches as well as positive, because if we don't, we will end up searching the same databases over and over. So in this case, I was following my research plan and searching for a divorce record. And these were digitized on Family Search for the appropriate years, 1925 to 1935. I reasoned that if Jack was born in 1926, that the marriage probably would have taken place about 1925, and a divorce would have happened anytime in those 10 years. But it was a negative search. These records were indexed, and going through all of the G's, there was nothing for a Green or a Graham. And so I created a citation that went into the research report that showed exactly what I was searching for and where I searched. So there will be no need to browse that index again. Now for DNA source citations, we can cite websites or charts that we've used. We can cite books where we get information about DNA inheritance. We can cite the matches, the family trees of matches. If we are publishing a report, maybe as a proof argument or even as a research report, we must have permission to use the names of living individuals, or we can redact the names for privacy issues, as I've done in this presentation. So I wanted to use the autosomal DNA testing comparison chart, and so I cited that from the IZOG wiki and the date I accessed it and the URL. And then I also wanted to cite DNA match for Jack Kenneth Schaefer and how much DNA was shared with CS, the 343 centimorgans, and the date that I accessed that match. As we are going through the research process and we are searching the records, we want to make sure that we are keeping track of those records in a research log. And this will help us to do the analysis, and it will help us as we write our conclusions because we have everything that we've thought about. We've captured the information from a source, we've captured our comments, our thoughts, and it's right there in our log, helping us to make connections and to correlate the evidence. A research log, by definition, is simply a record of what you're looking for, where you looked, and what you found. And your research log should be your best friend. This is where you can see everything at a glance that you've discovered. And I'm going to show you some examples for both documentary and genetic sources and entries in a research log. First of all, some categories that you could use. These are categories I like to use. You may want to add or subtract as needed. I like to put the date that I searched for a source. I like the repository. If I found something, I want to make sure I have the URL, the call number, the microfilm number. Even if I didn't find anything, I want to have those pieces of information so I know where I searched. I like to put what I'm searching for and the locality. And then the source citation lives in my research log. I've created it there the first time that I have searched a source, and that's where I can keep it for use in all sorts of other things. And then finally I have the results or the comments about the source, where I can do a simple abstract of the information or a simple transcription, or I can link to a Google Doc that has a full transcription. So many ways that you can get your information into your research log so that at a glance you can see what you found. So next on my research plan was to check out the city directories for Oklahoma City. And the city directory research discovered entries for Abner, Graham, and Eldon from 1925 to 1931. Tracking each one of those specific entries in the research log with the source citation and the exact address found Eldon listed as green in 1927 and 1928, and as Graham in 1925, 26, 29, and 31. Consistent with the city directories was the fact that she was always in the household of her father, either named as Ab or Abner Graham. So having all this information in my research log chronologically helped me to track their address. They did move within a few blocks from year to year, helped me track her surname, and to make sense of all the information I was finding. Here is what I recorded just for that city directory entry that we just looked at. So we have the date that I did the research, 7 March 2019. I looked at the city directory on Ancestry. There's a shortened link using bit links. I was searching for a city directory in the locality of Oklahoma City, and then there's my source citation and the results, just transcribed exactly from the city directory that she was going by Mrs. Eldon Green, and they were at 806A West 7th. Ab was a floorman, which means a janitor at this time, and he was at that address also. So my research log held every entry for the city directory research. Now what about research logs for DNA sources? We can track so many different things as we're working with the DNA. We can track cousin matches, correspondence with our DNA matches. We can track DNA reports, maybe our leads method color clustering. So we can start a spreadsheet and add columns as necessary. We can also use notes on the DNA testing company's sites, but it's very helpful to be able to track all the matches needed for a specific project in one spreadsheet, because this project was across 3 different DNA testing websites. Bringing them all together in one was very, very helpful. When analyzing YDNA results, I like to compare the client's results with the closest matches, so I created a page in my research log especially for the YDNA comparison. And I could highlight cells where different markers occur and check to see if these are fast-moving markers. These are markers that typically mutate more often, and I've used this analysis to determine a better idea which generation the most common ancestor might be found in. So sometimes we get a swing as large as 4 to 12 generations, and if I can see that there are some fast-moving markers where the differences have occurred, I can hypothesize that perhaps the common ancestor is closer to 4 rather than 12. So just an example of how you could set up something in your research log to analyze the DNA. And I love that in a spreadsheet we can have multiple pages. And so you can see here that this was my YDNA comparison, but also in this spreadsheet I had done some research on each of the different ROBs that seemed like they could be a possible ancestor. So I was able to keep all these in one place, just on different pages within the spreadsheet. Now, do you want to use a paper or electronic research log? Well, as we get more and more complicated data, and DNA does add more complicated data, I highly recommend using an electronic research log. You can keep a link or keep this in your computer files with each ancestor or family, and it lets you copy and paste information from websites, add links to online records, and really makes it so much easier to use your information if it's in a digital format. So you can also use a map or a chart, and I use Lucidchart. And so as I was doing the research, my Lucidchart became a research log as well, because it's a visual of the DNA matches and relationships. Just seeing them in a spreadsheet is not as useful when you're trying to see if the centimorgans and the relationships and the past ancestors all match up. So a tip in creating something like this for your own use or for a client project is to keep all the generations on the same line. You can do some color coding. In this example, I've got the DNA matches in pink. I have the client in green, and I've got in yellow the half-siblings or hypothesized half-siblings, and in blue the common ancestor. And the great thing about using a charting program is you can set this up any way you want and devise your own color scheme and really help others to visualize as well as yourself. If you're a professional researcher and you're going to be giving a report to a client and you've included DNA, then you're going to need to be able to show the client how things come together. And you can write about it in the report, but a picture is so helpful for the client as they are looking at what you've proposed for the DNA and the relationships. The culminating part of the genealogy research process is writing a conclusion. And don't risk losing the hard work of reasoning out a connection between DNA results and the documentary evidence by not writing anything. Get it in writing somewhere, somehow. Here's some different things that you could write. You could be writing a proof summary or argument. Generally, this is after you've done several iterations of a research project. You might have several research reports that you put together to form a proof argument. And especially if you're working with DNA, it may take several phases of a research project to get to proof. Maybe you just want to write some notes in your genealogy software about what you've found. And that proof argument that you write could become an article for publication in one of the genealogy journals. And you could get your research out there, especially if you've used DNA to prove something that is not going to be found any other way through documents. You're going to want to write something so that you can send it to DNA cousins and to your known cousins so that the family knows everything that you have learned from your great research. So how do you go about writing a conclusion? Well, here are some tips. Use a source citation to back up each statement that's not commonly known, and be extremely clear when writing about DNA results. They are difficult to explain, and you will need to use some visuals, such as a chart, diagrams, tables, and a single project may or may not get the hoped for results. Always include future research ideas for yourself or for a client. Start with your background information and just write anything to get started. What did you know at the beginning of the project? You can address the genealogical records that the client gave you or that you already had, and then you can talk about the DNA. And you may need to go back and forth between the two, talking about the documents, talking about DNA, back and forth. Address the information without any judgment. We don't know the whole story, only what the records and the DNA tell us. So here was the outline that I came up with for my case study. And when you're working with DNA and trying to combine that with documentary research into a report, it's very helpful to have an outline so that you get clear in your head what it is that you want to write about. So I outlined that I wanted to start with the background information, what was known first, and then I wanted to talk about Eldon and the records that we had found, the 1930 census, the city directories, the marriage record, and the census. And then I wanted to address the DNA test results and talk first about YDNA testing and the discovery of the Robb surname, and then the autosomal DNA testing. Then I wanted to come back to the documents and talk about Richard David Robb because we've identified him as a possible candidate. And I talked about his marriage and divorce to a Myrtle Hurley, which I discovered through documentary research. And I discovered that he had a daughter. They had a daughter, Alice Elizabeth Robb, who happened to be named in a pedigree of the DNA match. And I wanted to find him on the Oklahoma City directories, discuss that, and then his presence on the 1930 and 1940 censuses, and the obituary of Alice Elizabeth Robb that I had discovered. And then I wanted to wrap this all up in a nice conclusion and then have some ideas for future research. As we are writing things up, it's really important to correlate the evidence. We need to explain the significance of the key findings, both for ourselves, if this report is for us, and for our reader, if it's for a client or another family member. One of the tips is to be perfectly clear. Don't use a lot of pronouns. Make sure that whenever you're saying he or she, it's clear who you're referring to. And then also have someone else read the report. See if they understand what you're talking about. So here's a couple of examples from my report. City directories reveal Richard David Robb's presence in Oklahoma City in 1925. Also listed with Richard is an Edith in parentheses indicating she is a wife. Richard and Edith roomed at 118 West 8th. In 1925, Eldon May Graham and her father Abner lived at 326 West 9th. The proximity of the addresses makes it probable that this Richard Robb was the Richard David Robb of the DNA evidence. Jack Kenneth Schaefer was born 10 July 1926 and would have been conceived in September of 1925. No other Richard Robb appears in the Oklahoma City directory for 1925. All right, so we've got some paragraphs there that are explaining the research. Now, it's always helpful to have that visual. So this can be, a screenshot can be taken of your Lucid chart and put right into your report. So as you're discussing these various people, your reader will understand the relationships back. And so I found that Richard David Robb actually had a marriage to Myrtle Hurley, and that they had the daughter, Alice Elizabeth Betty Robb, and that DNA matches came through Alice. And those were key matches that pointed to this relationship. And then I also showed the relationship coming down for Eldon to Jack Jr. and Jack Sr. The obituary named the DNA match and parents Richard David Robb and Myrtle Hurley, which verified the other records. And in a report, you can abstract and transcribe documents like this for the reader. This obituary was key, and often when we're working with DNA, obituaries should be one of the very first sources that we search because they can name so many different descendants, and often they name living descendants who are our DNA matches. And that was the case in this obituary. This was an obituary for Alice Elizabeth Betty Robb Jones of Corpus Christi, Texas. And we have her birth date of June 9th, 1922 in Guthrie to Richard David and Myrtle Hurley Robb. And then her death date, her marriage date, and then survivors. And one of those daughters, which is anonymized here as CS, was the DNA match to Jack Kenneth Schaefer Jr. So in the conclusion, we can wrap everything up. Here's where we can bring together all of the DNA evidence, the documentary evidence, everything that we have been presenting in an entire report. The nice thing about a conclusion is that we don't need to cite it. We have source cited every single thing throughout the report, so here we can just clearly lay things out. And here is the conclusion for this project. Through DNA and documentary evidence, the father of Jack Kenneth Schaefer was proven to be Richard David Robb. Richard had married Myrtle Hurley in 1921, but was living with Edith George in Oklahoma City in the mid-1920s. He was present in the city directory of 1925 and in the same neighborhood as Eldon Graham. Their relationship is unknown, but the result was the child born in 1926 and named Jack Kenneth Green by his mother Eldon. Eldon also used the surname Green in the 1930 census and some city directory listings. So when we do our research report, we always want to include suggestions for the future research project. Whether this is for a client project or for yourself, you want to have this list while it's fresh in your head of what needs to be done next. For an ongoing DNA project, this could include additional testing, contacting of DNA matches, and additional analysis. It could also include building trees for matches, verifying trees, and more. For this case, the DNA evidence combined with the documentary research and was conclusive. But I've had many other cases involving DNA that the first project was really just the first phase of the research, and many more steps needed to be taken to come to proof. But here's some examples of future research suggestions that even though I was able to prove this relationship, there were other things that could be done, such as ordering those original birth certificates, and these had to be done by next of kin, so I put directions in there for the client to do that. And also the death certificate of Richard David Robb could be ordered. And then also to continue researching the Robb ancestry, trying to find that common ancestor that was shown in the YDNA test results. So as we come to the end of this presentation, I hope you've enjoyed following my progress as I took you through an entire research project. And I hope you can see how it was important to have an objective, analyze the sources, study the location, create a plan, keep a research log with source citations, and then to write a conclusion. And so as I followed this plan through, I was able to come to a good conclusion for the client with discovering the father of Jack Kenneth Sr. But whether you actually prove your hypothesis or whether you discover a missing ancestor, having gone through an entire process and done an entire project using the process and ending up with a written conclusion, it's going to give you a roadmap for what to do next. And when you return to this project, whether it's months or years later, you'll know exactly what you did and you can carry on as if no time had passed. You'll know exactly what you did and you'll remember everything that you did. So I just want to end with this quote. One of the worst things a genealogist can do is to get to the destination before making the journey. And I like that quote because the research process is the journey. And as we follow each of those steps, we originally get to our destination. And generally, it's going to be the correct destination rather than jumping ahead to something that we haven't taken the time to really prove and to really analyze. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a little bit about how you can use DNA in a research project of your own. We have a dedicated RootsTech page at familylocket.com/rootstech, and I invite you to go there and to learn more about other things that we offer, our articles, our newsletter, our books, courses, and our podcast. We do lots and lots of teaching on using DNA in traditional genealogy research together to make great discoveries. And so I invite you to join us and to learn more as you continue your journey with using DNA in your genealogy. Please visit RootsTech Connect to watch other presentations. Thank you again for watching.